Over the past decade, crypto markets have positioned themselves as an alternative to traditional finance, faster, borderless, and less dependent on institutional gatekeepers. But when a single project saw roughly $120 million in investor capital move out of its liquidity pools within a short window, regulators weren't just looking at a token collapse. They were examining a structural question. How does that level of capital shift through a decentralized system without automatic safeguards activating? Legally speaking, this case isn't just about alleged misconduct. It's about liquidity control, disclosure obligations, and whether existing securities and fraud laws adequately map onto programmable finance. From a regulatory standpoint, the more important issue is not who clicked transfer, but how governance design, exchange infrastructure, and compliance gaps allowed the transfers to occur at scale. Because if decentralized markets can move 9 figures in minutes, the real risk isn't volatility, it's oversight lag. In the United States, moving $120 million through traditional financial channels is a heavily regulated process. Banks, broker-dealers, custodians, and clearinghouses act as both intermediaries and oversight mechanisms, introducing friction and traceability at nearly every stage. Each intermediary serves as a checkpoint, a compliance officer, an audit trail, or an operational control. These layers are designed to protect investors and enforce accountability. Delays, approvals, and regulatory checks make large-scale capital transfers slower, but they also provide transparency and enforceable oversight. Decentralized finance, or DeFi, was conceived to reduce these frictions. It promises borderless markets, instantaneous execution, and reduced dependence on centralized institutions. While these features offer efficiency and innovation, they also introduce structural vulnerabilities. In this case, the project under review accumulated roughly $120 million through token sales and liquidity provision in decentralized exchange pools. Investors contributed capital under the assumption that the project's code and smart contracts would govern fund usage. Legally speaking, the immediate issue is not whether the token price dropped or whether investors lost money. The focus is on governance and control. Who had authority over liquidity? Were smart contracts designed to restrict withdrawal? Were investors fully informed about the technical permissions controlling their funds? These questions shift the conversation from individual culpability to systemic oversight. From a regulatory standpoint, the case illuminates the tension between innovation and enforceable compliance. Securities laws, anti-fraud statutes, and fiduciary obligations exist to ensure transparency and protect investors. But programmable systems, such as smart contracts, embed control mechanisms within code rather than within regulatory filings or board approvals. That introduces what enforcement agencies call a lag window, a period in which transactions execute faster than oversight can respond. Systemically, the vulnerability arises because decentralized exchanges rely on automated market maker formulas, and token liquidity is often concentrated in developer-controlled wallets. In situations where liquidity is not time-locked or multi-signature controlled, a single withdrawal can trigger structural effects. Notably, this is not the same as a hack. No external actor is compromising the system. Instead, the system allows rapid capital movement as designed, highlighting how operational permission structures can create legal and regulatory exposure. What makes this case analytically significant is that it frames the incident not as a dramatic criminal narrative, but as a study in structural design and regulatory adaptation. The investigation focused on reconstructing the flow of funds through complex technical infrastructure, understanding smart contract governance, and evaluating whether disclosures met legal standards. It is the intersection of programmable finance, legal accountability, and investor protection that gives this case its broader implications. By framing the $120 million movement as a systemic and regulatory question, rather than an isolated act of wrongdoing, we set the stage for a high-retention analysis that emphasizes method over sensationalism.
Viewers are prompted to consider not just what happened, but why the system allowed it, and what that means for investors, regulators, and the broader digital finance ecosystem.
To understand how $120 million could move in a decentralized system, it is necessary to examine the underlying financial and technical structures. In DeFi, liquidity pools function as the backbone of trading. These pools pair a project's token with a stable asset, often a stablecoin or Ethereum, and provide the automated market maker formulas that determine token pricing. Unlike traditional exchanges, there are no centralized order books or human intermediaries adjusting liquidity. The system relies entirely on code. Investors contribute capital under the assumption that the code will enforce fairness and stability. However, smart contracts are only as effective as their design. In this case, liquidity pool tokens, the representations of ownership over deposited funds, remained fully accessible to the project developers. Without time locks, multi-signature controls, or external auditing mechanisms, these tokens can be redeemed at any moment, effectively withdrawing the underlying assets. Financially, the immediate consequence of liquidity removal is structural rather than emotional. When the liquidity pool was accessed and funds removed, pricing mechanisms reacted automatically. Automated market makers calculate token value based on the ratio of assets in the pool. A sudden withdrawal reduces supply, creating slippage that magnifies selling pressure and accelerates price decline. Secondary market participants experience widened spreads, and the token's apparent market capitalization can collapse in minutes. Technically, investigators traced fund movements through the blockchain's public ledger. Each transfer is immutable and timestamped. Using transaction graph analysis, clusters of addresses likely controlled by the same entity were identified. Intermediary wallets were mapped to follow the capital trail across multiple transfers, demonstrating that the system did not obscure movement, but instead recorded it permanently. From a regulatory standpoint, these digital breadcrumbs are critical. Once funds reach exchanges operating under U.S. law, compliance teams can match blockchain addresses to verified identities. What makes this mechanism significant is that it highlights systemic exposure. Unlike traditional banks, where internal controls delay or prevent mass withdrawals, DeFi permits immediate execution once permissions exist. This structural design amplifies speed and scale while reducing friction, but it also increases regulatory risk. Legally speaking, the mechanism itself does not prove intent. A withdrawal can occur due to market strategy, operational decisions, or negligence. The investigation, therefore, focuses not on the act of execution alone, but on how disclosure, governance, and code design interact with investor reliance and regulatory obligations. From an educational perspective, this analysis emphasizes system architecture over individual culpability. By understanding liquidity controls, automated market mechanisms, and wallet routing, viewers can appreciate how large-scale capital movements are possible and why these movements trigger scrutiny from regulators, compliance officers, and blockchain forensic specialists. Once the liquidity withdrawal occurred, investigators faced a critical question. How do you reconstruct a $120 million flow in a decentralized system that is both public and pseudonymous? Unlike traditional banking, where account statements and transaction approvals are centralized, blockchain transactions exist on a distributed ledger. Every transfer is permanent, time-stamped, and publicly accessible, but the parties behind wallet addresses are initially anonymous. From a technical standpoint, investigation relied on transaction graph analysis, a methodology that maps the flow of funds across addresses and identifies patterns of behavior. Specialized blockchain analytics firms, such as Chainalysis, employ clustering algorithms to group wallets likely controlled by the same entity. These clusters reveal fund routing patterns that would otherwise be invisible to casual observers.
In practice, the $120 million was moved across a network of intermediary wallets. Each transfer introduced additional addresses, but investigators looked for behavioral fingerprints, the timing of transactions, amounts moved, and interaction with known exchange wallets. Patterns emerged that suggested coordinated control rather than random transfers. Legally speaking, this evidence establishes a factual foundation for tracing ownership, though it does not by itself prove intent. The critical moment occurs when funds interact with centralized exchanges subject to U.S. regulation. Compliance frameworks require Know Your Customer (KYC) verification and anti-money laundering reporting. Investigators can subpoena exchange records to link blockchain addresses to verified identities. From a regulatory standpoint, this is where pseudonymity collapses. The combination of immutable ledger data and enforceable identity verification creates a robust investigative pathway. In addition to blockchain tracing, metadata analysis plays an essential role. Email communications, messaging logs, and cloud storage access records can provide context about timing, decision-making, and operational responsibilities. While blockchain demonstrates movement, metadata can establish the structural narrative of control. Financially, this methodology reveals the interaction between system design and human oversight. While the smart contracts executed transfers automatically, investigators leveraged both technological transparency and regulatory authority to reconstruct the event sequence. From a U.S. enforcement perspective, this approach demonstrates that distributed systems do not eliminate accountability, they merely shift the investigation toward analytical reconstruction. Educationally, the takeaway is that traceability in blockchain is not the same as anonymity. Every transaction is a recorded data point that, when combined with regulatory tools, can produce a clear audit trail. High-value transfers like this one trigger complex, multi-layer analysis that bridges technology, finance, and law. This forensic approach sets the stage for understanding how regulatory enforcement adapts to programmable financial instruments and why systemic design, rather than human error, is often the central issue.
Once the capital flow and technical mechanisms were reconstructed, investigators and regulators turned to the legal framework. From a U.S. perspective, the primary focus is not simply the movement of funds, but whether the actions intersected with securities laws, fraud statutes, or fiduciary obligations. Structurally, the investigation must link the system's design and operational choices to established legal standards. In cases involving tokenized assets, the first question is often classification. Are the tokens securities under the Howey test? This legal standard considers an instrument a security if it represents an investment of money in a common enterprise with the expectation of profits derived substantially from the efforts of others. Legally speaking, if the token meets these criteria, it triggers disclosure obligations, anti-fraud statutes, and investor protection measures. Prosecutors must demonstrate that material information about liquidity, governance, or operational control was omitted or misrepresented. The next critical element is intent. Removing liquidity from a pool is not automatically illegal. Execution can result from operational error, market strategy, or programmatic decisions. Prosecutors must establish that the individual or team acted knowingly to defraud investors. Evidence supporting intent often comes from internal communications or planning documents, pre-withdrawal announcements or promises, timing patterns that suggest coordinated extraction. Financially, the legal question focuses on reliance and harm. Investors must have reasonably relied on disclosures or marketing claims when contributing capital. The resulting losses quantify the potential damages. From a regulatory standpoint, U.S. enforcement involves multiple agencies. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission may investigate potential securities violations, while the Federal Bureau of Investigation handles fraud or cross-border financial crimes. Coordinated approaches leverage subpoena power, KYC records from exchanges, and blockchain tracing to establish both the factual and legal basis of claims.
Legally, one of the challenges is distinguishing structural risk from fraudulent conduct. Smart contracts and decentralized execution create a lag in oversight. An execution executed according to code does not inherently equate to fraud, but a lack of disclosure about permissions or control can. Courts often have to consider whether investors understood the structural framework and whether any omission or misrepresentation meets statutory thresholds. What makes this case instructive is that it highlights how existing laws adapt to programmable finance. Prosecutors are not just analyzing transactions, they are examining systemic design, governance control, and disclosure practices to determine whether existing statutes apply. This transforms the discussion from individual wrongdoing to regulatory and structural accountability. For viewers, the analytical takeaway is clear. In decentralized markets, legality depends not only on action, but on how action intersects with disclosure, investor reliance, and structural design. High-value cases like this illustrate the evolving boundaries of enforcement in U.S. financial and technological law.
Once legal theories were established, the case moved into the practical arena of enforcement and litigation. From a U.S. perspective, prosecuting decentralized financial activity presents unique challenges. Unlike traditional securities fraud, where bank records, signed contracts, and corporate filings provide direct evidence, decentralized systems rely on programmatic execution and pseudonymous ledger entries. Courts must interpret whether transactions executed according to smart contract permissions can constitute violations under existing statutes. One of the most significant considerations in court is jurisdiction. Developers and operators may reside outside the United States, while investors are located domestically. U.S. regulators and prosecutors must demonstrate that federal law applies to the transactions and that the defendants had sufficient nexus with U.S. markets to permit enforcement. This often requires careful coordination through mutual legal assistance treaties, MITLATs, and cross-border regulatory collaboration. Another central challenge is classification. Are the tokens commodities, securities, or utility instruments? The designation affects both prosecutorial authority and the applicable statutory framework. For example, if the token is deemed a security, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission has authority to enforce disclosure and anti-fraud provisions. If considered a commodity, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, CFTC, may assert jurisdiction over derivatives or price manipulation. Courts must reconcile these classifications with the underlying technology and investor expectations. From a practical standpoint, digital evidence is critical. Blockchain analysis provides immutable records of transaction flows, but it does not, by itself, establish intent. Investigators combine ledger data with exchange KYC records, internal communications, and other metadata to reconstruct the decision-making context. Legally speaking, courts must weigh this evidence to determine whether the defendants acted knowingly, recklessly, or negligently. Defense strategies often emphasize technical ambiguity and systemic risk. Developers may argue that smart contracts executed automatically, market volatility caused loss, and investors assumed operational risks inherent to decentralized systems. Prosecutors counter by highlighting disclosure omissions, coordinated fund routing, and any communications suggesting awareness of potential harm. Finally, court dynamics also consider remedies and enforcement. Even if intent is difficult to prove, regulators can impose civil penalties, require restitution, or mandate compliance enhancements. These measures focus less on punitive narratives and more on systemic correction and investor protection. From an analytical perspective, the enforcement process illustrates that decentralized financial innovation does not remove legal accountability. Instead, it shifts the investigation toward reconstructing structural design, governance, and disclosure. High-retention viewers gain insight into the interplay between technology, law, and oversight.
The complexity is not in criminal action alone, but in how programmable systems interface with existing regulatory frameworks. This act emphasizes systemic learning rather than drama, preparing the audience for the subsequent discussion on broader industry impact and regulatory implications.
Beyond the immediate legal outcome, the $120 million crypto exit scenario illustrates structural lessons for the broader industry. From a regulatory perspective, cases like this drive policy adaptation, compliance improvements, and shifts in risk assessment across U.S. financial markets. The core lesson is that decentralized systems, while technologically innovative, do not exist outside of the jurisdiction of law, particularly when U.S. investors are involved. One immediate effect has been on token classification and disclosure standards. Regulators, including the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, have increasingly emphasized that tokens resembling securities must meet disclosure and anti-fraud requirements. This influences not only startups, but also established exchanges and DeFi platforms seeking regulatory clarity. Legally speaking, the case reinforces that investor protection cannot be delegated solely to code. Structural transparency must be paired with enforceable governance mechanisms. From an operational standpoint, exchanges have implemented enhanced monitoring tools. These include transaction anomaly detection, automated wallet clustering, and tighter KYC/AML procedures. The goal is to flag unusually large fund movements before they result in investor harm. In essence, the $120 million movement served as a practical stress test of compliance infrastructure. Platforms with robust monitoring could mitigate systemic risk. Those without were exposed. Technological implications are equally significant. Smart contracts and decentralized governance models are being reevaluated. Time-locked liquidity, multi-signature wallets, and on-chain transparency dashboards are now standard considerations for new projects. This case highlights that programmable finance is not inherently immune to legal or financial risk. Instead, governance design directly influences regulatory exposure. From a policy standpoint, federal authorities are increasingly leveraging blockchain analysis to inform enforcement strategy. Cross-agency cooperation, including between the Federal Bureau of Investigation and financial regulators, demonstrates that decentralized systems can be integrated into traditional investigative frameworks. Regulatory guidance is evolving to clarify both developer obligations and investor rights, establishing precedent for future cases. Finally, the broader implication for the U.S. market is clear. Innovation without compliance creates structural risk. Investors, founders, and platforms must navigate not only technological execution, but also regulatory expectations. This case underscores that systemic oversight, transparency in governance, and alignment with legal frameworks are as critical to market stability as any technological advancement. Educationally, the lesson is twofold. Transparency enables accountability, but transparency alone does not suffice. Structural design, disclosure, and regulatory integration collectively determine whether a system operates safely and legally. For high-retention viewers, this analysis reinforces that the intersection of finance, technology, and law drives both risk and opportunity in digital markets, and that understanding structural vulnerabilities is essential for evaluating emerging financial ecosystems.
The $120 million liquidity event provides a wealth of lessons for U.S. investors, project founders, and regulators alike. From an analytical standpoint, these lessons focus on structural design, governance transparency, and the intersection of law and technology, rather than dramatizing individual actions. For investors, the first key insight is the importance of verifying liquidity controls. In decentralized finance, ownership of liquidity pool tokens determines the ability to withdraw assets. When these tokens are not time-locked or secured via multi-signature wallets, control rests with a small group, often the project's developers. Legally speaking,
undisclosed control introduces risk, even if no malicious intent exists. Understanding the mechanics of tokenomics and smart contract permissions is critical before committing capital. Second, disclosure matters. Investor reliance is central to securities and fraud statutes. If marketing materials, social media posts, or technical documentation omit critical information about liquidity, governance, or operational authority, the project may be exposed to regulatory scrutiny. This reinforces that transparency is not only ethical, but also a practical legal safeguard. For founders and developers, governance design is paramount. Time-locked contracts, multi-signature authorization, and routine external audits are not just best practices, they are structural mechanisms that reduce regulatory and financial exposure. Smart contracts provide automated execution, but the legal framework evaluates whether those contracts align with disclosure obligations and fiduciary duties. From a regulatory standpoint, poor governance can equate to structural negligence. Regulators and exchanges also gain lessons from this case. Systems that combine immutable blockchain records with KYC/AML enforcement can trace funds effectively, even in pseudonymous environments. Cross-agency coordination, rapid access to compliance data, and advanced transaction graph analysis enhance oversight capabilities. This case demonstrates that technological transparency, combined with legal authority, is the most effective tool for protecting investors and maintaining market integrity. Finally, the broader educational takeaway is structural rather than procedural. Investors should evaluate the governance and disclosure mechanisms embedded in financial products. Founders should design with compliance in mind, recognizing that decentralization does not eliminate legal obligations. Regulators should continue integrating technological understanding into enforcement strategy. In essence, the $120 million movement is less a story about misconduct and more a case study in systemic risk, technological governance, and regulatory adaptation. High-value capital transfers in programmable finance highlight the speed at which frictionless systems can expose structural weaknesses. Transparency alone is insufficient. Oversight and design must be proactive. For viewers seeking to understand the evolving landscape of digital finance, this case illustrates a fundamental principle. The safety, legality, and sustainability of decentralized systems depend on structural integrity and regulatory alignment, not on luck or good intentions.
The $120 million crypto exit scenario is more than a single case. It's a lens into the structural realities of decentralized finance. Investors, developers, and regulators all operate within the same framework: transparency, governance, and disclosure. High-speed, programmable systems reduce friction, but they also amplify structural vulnerabilities. Legally and financially, the lessons are clear. Control, disclosure, and regulatory alignment determine whether a system operates safely and sustainably. For U.S. viewers, this case emphasizes the importance of understanding not just market mechanics, but how the law interacts with technology. Programmable finance doesn't eliminate accountability. It shifts the investigative and legal focus towards system design, smart contract permissions, and disclosure practices. If you found this analysis insightful, consider subscribing for more content that breaks down real-world financial and legal cases in a way that is factual, educational, and easy to understand. Hit the notification bell to stay updated, because understanding structural risk is the first step toward informed participation in emerging markets. Finally, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Which part of this case, governance design, regulatory oversight, or blockchain transparency, do you think has the most lasting impact on U.S. markets? Your perspective helps us explore these complex topics in depth.